Now that we've completed the unit section of Vivid Creations mixing PCR, we can move on to the cost section. The first thing we got to do is figure out what amount of cost are we going to have to account for. Well, what cost was put into units during the period? We have that information up on top. Some of it is going to be what was already committed in beginning WIP, and some of it's going to be what we added during the period. So for what was already committed to our units in beginning WIP, our information tells us there was already $20,000 in direct materials, and there was already $25,000 of conversion costs, for a total of $45,000 worth of costs that were already in the batches of crayon mixture that we had going when this month of December began. And what amount of cost did we add during the period? Well, information tells us that too. Vivid put in $80,000 worth of materials within this department and $81,600 worth of conversion costs. And all in all, the mixing department of Vivid Creations added $161,600 worth of costs during the period. So what do we need to account for? Well, we need to account for a total of $100,000 worth of material costs. We need to account for a total of $106,600 worth of conversion costs, the $25,000 we started with plus the $81,600 we added. And all in all, doesn't matter if you want to add these two together or add these two together, we've got to account for $206,600 worth of cost that was put into these units during the period. Well, what is our cost per equivalent units going to be? The first thing we want to do is take the cost that we added during the period for direct materials and conversion costs. And we have those right up above. We added $80,000 in material costs and $81,600 in conversion costs. For those costs, how many equivalent units could we have made? Well, for direct materials, we know that $80,000 was enough to make 5,000 batches of crayons from start to finish, our equivalent units. And for conversion costs, that $81,600 was enough to make 5,100 batches of crayons from start to finish. So to find my cost per equivalent unit, all I'm going to do is take how much got added during the period and divide by the total equivalent units of production we know that could have made. If $80,000 is enough to, $80,000 in material costs is enough to make 5,000 batches, well then each batch, start to finish, costs, weird formatting right there, $16 in material costs to complete. $81,600 worth of conversion costs would have been enough to make 5,100 batches of crayons from start to finish. That is also $16. So in the mixing department, to properly mix a batch of crayons to be made into crayons, properly molded crayons, it's $16 in materials and $16 in conversion costs. Well, now that we have that, we can use that information to figure out where this $206,600 worth of costs ends up. From beginning WIP over here, we are going to start with the costs that were already in beginning WIP, the 1,000 units at the beginning of the period. We have that right up here. The units in beginning WIP had $20,000 in material costs, $25,000 in conversion costs, for a total of $45,000 worth of costs already committed to them. What did we have to add to those to finish them? And to do that, because this is beginning WIP, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the beginning EUP, the amount of units we could have made start to finish for the cost we had to add to our beginning inventory to finish it, and I'm going to multiply that by our cost for EUP. So our equivalent units of production for beginning WIP for materials up here was 0, and each one cost $16. So if you multiply those two together, because everything multiplied by 0 is 0, you get 0. We didn't have to add any cost for materials to our beginning WIP because that beginning WIP was already 100% done for direct materials when the period started. But we did have to add some conversion costs. So how much are we going to add? Use the same formula. Our equivalent units to complete our beginning WIP was 500. And each batch of crayons that we make requires $16 of conversion costs to be committed to that product. And if I multiply those two together, I get $8,000. So we didn't have to add any material costs, but we added $8,000 in conversion costs, and that is a total of $8,000 in total that we added during the period. So what is the total that we had from beginning inventory? If you add these two numbers together, you get 53,000. Those 1,000 units in beginning WIP ended up costing us $53,000 between what we committed last period and what we put in to finish them in this period. And because we are a FIFO company, that $53,000 should get transferred first. What about the units that we started and completed during the period? Well, that was, as we determined up here, 3,000 units. And the equivalent unit of production is the same because if we started and completed them, it has to have all of the costs put in. And to make a batch, it costs you $16 in materials if you make them from start to finish, which we did here. And it costs you $16 conversion costs if you make them from start to finish, which we did here. So all I got to do here for this is take, I'm going to call it my S&C for started and completed, equivalent units of production, and multiply that by my cost per equivalent unit of production. And if I go through, that is going to be equal to, in this case, the 3,000 units that we have right there times 16 bucks. That is 48,000. We also had 3,000 equivalent units of production for conversion costs, and the conversion cost per equivalent unit is $16 as well. So those 3,000 units that we made from start to finish, which we ended up transferring off to be molded, cost us $96,000 in total. And what amount of cost are we transferring then? Well, the units in beginning WIP cost us $5,300. The units that we started and completed cost us $96,000. This is the 1,000 units for beginning WIP we transferred. This is the 3,000 units we started and completed that we transferred. We're accounting for all of the, all the way at the top, 4,000 units that we completed and transferred during the period. And they were transferred with a cost of $149,000 associated with them. Now we got to figure out what amount of cost ends up in our ending WIP. So here, since we're talking about ending WIP, it's ending EUP times cost per EUP. And I can go through and I can take my equivalent units in ending WIP for direct materials, which is 2,000. Multiply that by the $16 cost of materials per equivalent unit, and that's 32,000. The ending WIP will have $32,000 in material costs already committed to it when this period ends. Because we didn't have all of our units in ending WIP done for conversion costs, our equivalent units was only 1,600, less than the 2,000 physical units that were there. And each equivalent unit costs 16 bucks, so 1,600 times 16 is $25,600. And we add those two numbers together, and we're going to come up with $57,600. So what are our total costs that we have accounted for? Well, for our direct materials, we accounted for the $20,000 that was already committed to beginning WIP, the $0, if you will, of material costs that we added to it, the $48,000 in material costs we put into the units that we started and completed during the period, and the $32,000 in material costs that we committed to the units which ended up in ending WIP. And if we total that up, it's right on the dot, $100,000. And what did we have to account for? $100,000. And what did we account for? $100,000. So we've accounted for all of our material costs. I'm just going to turn that blue to make it check that we know what we have. We've got to account for $106,600 worth of conversion costs. Well, let's try to do that. We started with $25,000 already committed in conversion cost to our beginning WIP. We added another $8,000 of that into that beginning WIP of conversion cost to finish it. We made a bunch of units from start to finish and incurred $48,000 in conversion cost to do so. And we've already committed $25,600 worth of conversion cost to the units, which we're still working on when the period ends. And if we total that all up, it's $106,600. And just like before, those two numbers match, so we know we're good there. Over here, for our total costs to account for, be very careful. A common mistake I see people make is to add up this whole entire column, but the problem is like this number is already the subtotal of the two numbers that are above it, and this number is the subtotal of those two numbers above it. All you're really accounting for right here at the end is what portion of your costs into units, which got transferred out, which is 149,000, and what portion of those costs were into units that are still here in ending WIP, which our table says is 57,600. I add those two together, and I get 206,600. So we have accounted for all of the costs that we needed to account for. We're going to, at this point in time, transfer $149,000 worth of costs over to the molding PCR, because those, when the physical units get transferred to the next phase of production, the costs accompanying them go with it. Well, the remaining $57,600 in costs is going to end up here in mixing department's ending WIP.